committed at 427 4th Street, far 15 minutes from my home. And to my surprise, I realized there was a lot of information about the murder. So very excited, I decided to write an article about that crime. Oana will send you the article link by email. Next, please. This extreme form of domestic violence was not an isolated event in the city's daily life, nor is it rare today. Sadly, it has been part of human history and it continues to occur into the present day. The magnitude of frequency of the crime are such that it has earned the name femicide in the penal system of many Western countries. Next. Sarah came to Canada at the end of the same year. The reasons she remained alone in England are unknown. From the information gathered from the press news reading, one might say that life for her in England, living with a drunken, low-paid, and unsatisfied worker, was probably a miserable one. Still, they had agreed to make a new start in a new country. And next, please. Henry began to send letters to Sarah, more than 10 in 8 days. Desperate because he was not getting any answers and determined to end his suffering and anger, Henry bought a .32 caliber revolver from Speck and Crandall, a local store. He told the salesman that he needed a gun to destroy a rat's nest, but later informed the police that he had wanted to commit suicide, but had repented. Next, please. On June the 3rd, Henry went home in the morning, and without a word, he shot her in the head. Henry's action shows a cold, ruthless man who had planned to kill his wife. He was in full control of the situation and carried out the plan he had conceived beforehand. Although Sarah has been exposed to the savage attack, none came to her rescue. Violence against women was often unattended by public services, and even more for immigrants who generally lacked close relatives in the new resident. Next, please. What this case highlights are the helplessness of women in the face of domestic violence and the absence of adequate protection for the battered wives, daughters, and other female household members. A crime committed in the beginning of the 20th century that continues to be repeated in the 21st century urges effective action. That is all I wanted to tell you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to stop the share for a second. Got a whole bunch of people trying to get in. All right. So thank you very much, Jorge. And I just wanted to repeat, if you have any questions, please add them in the chat and we'll have a chance to go over them at the end. Next up, we have a presentation by Isis. She has also been with the New Westminster Museum for a year. Isis is a graphic designer and she's been volunteering with the museum. During this time, she's studied, looked into things like hygiene in the local newspapers, and for a potential exhibit on the bathrooms of New West. And in addition to that, she has helped us out with writing some social media posts, and that's how this presentation, it came out of that. So Isis, you can take it away from here.
Okay. First of all, hello everyone. Thank you, Anna, for the nice presentation about me. And well, let's start. Okay, today I will talk about the Chinese immigration through Wanhongwu, which was one of the most important companies in the Chinatown in the Royal City, and the connection with the economic boom of New Westminster. The Chinese community became firmly established during the gold rush in 1850s, forming the large Chinatown in Canada on the eastern and Front Street. This Chinatown contribute to and benefit from the economic growth and success of the Royal City. New Westminster experienced a further economic boom as a result of its connection to the Canadian Pacific Railway at the construction of the Vancouver terminus. We can see on the picture on the left side, it's a pictures. Well, actually, it's a lithograph. It's a kind of drawing about this important company, Wanhongwu Corporation, and which is so important is because, well, of course, Chinese immigrate before this time, but what is just the role important of this company is because a massive group of men's worker became to work in the Royal City through this company. This lithograph, it's circa is from 1990. It was featured in the local newspaper. The next slide, please, Oana. Okay, so now I will explain how important was the Wanhongwu Corporation. Wanhongwu Corporation was one of the large storefront in the downtown New Westminster. It was founded in 1887 with a substantial capital input from Chinese investors. Wanhongwu Corporation pours a portion of the beautiful brick builder Armstrong block on Columbus Street. Okay, so how this company has a huge capital for Chinese investors was one of the first basically kind of like a retail, important retail in Chinatown and in Westminster. Because if we compare how the small business which was surrounded this big brick build was like no very important like these ones. All the small stores around was basically managed more for more poor people. They were selling even food on the street. So this brick build became really important in the downtown and New Westminster. The Wanhongwu Corporation carried a large and assorted stock of Chinese and Japanese ware, as tea, silk, china, and fancy goods. One of another important commodities they brought from China was a large quantity of rice sacks. This cereal, it was imported in a semi-finished state to be cleaned and prepared for the British Columbia market with 12-foot operate machines operated by the company employees for sure. Sorry. Okay, so in our left side, it's a picture from, his name was Li Qing. He was one of the most important manager of the company. Circa of the picture is 19th. Next slide, please, Oana. Oh, sorry about that. Sorry, can you back to the other one? Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, so now I will explain a very important thing about the one of the commodities they brought from China, which is opium, and how these contribute to the economy of the city when opium was legal, of course. The Wanhonghu Corporation also thrived on the manufacture and distribution of opium, which was sold through its new Westminster store and supplied in quantity to the workers that it employed as a major labor contractor. The company opium factory was an important part of its financial success, and it operated in the heart of the city of downtown New Westminster. Opium had different process of roasting until it's turned out ready for pipe. Work in these mills and factories gave employment a large number of men. However, the opium manufacturing process caused an overpowering smell and fumes that hover or low in the air along Front Street elicit many complaints. The company tried without success to solve this problem by erecting a tall smoke stack to carry away the fumes that unfortunately made everything worse. So they didn't fix the problem, the pollution problem. Further, the opium usage brought with this great crime and health concern, causing considerably alarm for the police force in the city council. Something that I want to add, like describe in a small way, that after the big fire in 1898, the new Chinatown was built in the neighborhood called Swamp. So this way, the Chinese community demonstrate that their economic strength and the merchants. So how the powerful the Wanhonghu company or corporation, they lost no time to reestablish its lucrative opium business, erecting a one-store brick block. It's front in all Front Street size. So it means like they rebuilt after the fire. They rebuilt, I think it was the first floor of their Armstrong building where they had the company before. So basically, this one of the first building in rebuilt after the big fire. But how all that the problems that opium concern, not just the health concern and the crime, these problems were used to relate by local government to enact a legislation restrict Chinese freedom, ultimately concluding with the opium being made illegal in 1908 by the Prime Minister King. Next slide, please, Savannah. Okay, so in addition, Wanhonghu Corporation controls 75% of all the Chinese worker and the CPR line. Later, Wanhonghu opened a fruit and fish cannery in Queensborough called Westminster Cannery. The prominence of Wanhonghu and its important contribution to the economy of the city was recognized through the flattering article in a local newspaper. The picture on the left, it's a, sorry, I couldn't find the real Westminster Cannery picture, but I put this to show like how at that time how the Chinese fishermen were working in a cannery. This picture is from the Mackey Cannery at 537 From Street. This picture is from 1905. And yes, and yeah, that's it. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Isis. That was really interesting.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, just one thing. So if somebody else is interested in go more deep in this information, I highly recommend this book where I got all the information. It's called GFAO, Speaking Through Memory. So you can find this book on the New Westminster Library. So if someone is interested in all these, this is a very nice book. So I highly recommend it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Audrey. And Audrey is, she's been with us for a few years now. Audrey is currently a student at the UBC School of Information. She's doing library and archive studies. And Audrey has been both helping out with research, and before the pandemic, she was helping out at the museum behind the scenes with the artifacts. So Audrey, you can take it away now.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Oana. It's fitting that that we just learned about Chinatown, because my story with my experience with Mary starts in a very similar place, with researching a pair of Chinese boiler tongs. And in there, I learned the story of Mary Ellen Cox. If we could move to the next slide, please. So Mary Ellen Cox was born around 1878, we think, to Gassendi Cox and Susan Irving Cox, who was the daughter of Captain William Irving. Captain William Irving is, of course, the man who owned Irving House here in New Westminster, and which the New Westminster Museum and Archives now manages as a museum. Growing up, Mary and her family lived in Portland, Vancouver, and Victoria before they settled down in Sacramento, California, where Mary and her two sisters, Susan and Britomart, grew up. Throughout their childhood, the Cox sisters were active participants in the artistic and social scenes of Sacramento, performing in musical groups, going to social events and parties, and taking part in amateur plays. Mary also had a local reputation as a very adept equestrian and appeared in several newspaper articles at the time. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. When Mary grew up, both she and her sister Susan became teachers. Mary, in particular, became very well known as a popular and accomplished teacher who specialized in teaching reading to elementary school students. She taught at one point in her career, she taught at Edward Kelly School in Sacramento, California. And because of this, she had a number of Japanese immigrants in her class. On February 19th, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which resulted in the forced relocation and confinement of over 120,000 Japanese Americans to internment camps. This included Mary's students. Throughout their internment, Mary kept in touch with her former students, exchanging letters with them and writing to various authorities pleading on their behalf. Of her many letters with her students, 6 still survive, with her letters with Sanji Saito, R. Sato, Susama Paul Sato, Kiyo Sato, and Tomi Kabata. They've been archived as part of the Gerald Lampoli collection of Japanese American letters, which can be accessed at the Smithsonian Online Virtual Archives. In the letters that survive of her correspondence with her students, we find that many of them credit her letters of recommendation with the government permitting them and their families to leave the camps and even attend universities. An interesting story about these letters is that because she was exchanging so many letters with her students, the government sent an agent to investigate what the letters were about. They arrived at her house and confiscated the letters that she had received from her students. For his own personal reasons, the government agent decided to keep these letters in his collection. Later on, he destroyed all but 6 of them. These 6 were later donated to the National Museum of American History. Other memories of the war, the internment, and Mary as a teacher can be found in a book written by our student Kiyo Sato, entitled Kiyo Sato: From a World War II Japanese Internment Camp to a Life of Service. Among other memories, Kiyo remembers Mary as a very fashionable teacher with a distinct sense of style who always wore a hat. If we could go to the next slide, please. So Mary continued teaching and educating others throughout her life. In 1953, she published Teach Your Child to Read, a book for parents, which would go on to be quoted in master's thesis on education. In 1966, she published a second book, Saga of a Seafarer, which is the first and I believe only biography of her grandfather, Captain William Irving. Her annotated research materials are archived at the New Westminster Museum and Archives, along with her scrapbook, photo albums, and other personal collections. Mary was also an active participant in the arts, and she studied theater under the silent actress Madame Pilar Moran in New York, and she was known in the theater worlds of New York and California. She was also a world traveler, and she made many friends across the world during her travels. Always with an eye for history, she collected artifacts and items, both from her own family history and from people and places around the world, and she maintained a close friendship with the early curators of the Irving House Museum. We have surviving correspondence that shows her of her donations to the museum and of her conversations with the curators about her family history. So Mary is a very interesting figure in history, and I find her a very interesting archival figure. Although she has appeared in many different stories, from her students' stories to her grandfather's to the Irving House Museum itself, we don't know very much about her. We don't know when she was born, we don't know when she died, and we don't know many details about her own life. But at the same time, we do find these little bits and glimpses throughout the archives. We know that she was a very artistically minded person who loved theater, played music, and had a very distinctive sense of fashion. We know that she was a very social person from a young age who made many friends and built up many relationships around the world. We know that she had a large interest in history, especially her own family history, and that she worked hard to preserve and share those stories. All these little bits and pieces we know from what survives in other people's archives: newspaper records, memoirs, personal collections. Although she never touched her own story, although she never told her own story, Mary touched so many lives. And in the details and the memories of those records, we can begin to understand who she was and what kind of an impact she had on other people. I stumbled across Mary's story almost by accident. Like I said at the beginning of the presentation, I was researching a pair of boiler tongs, and I found that they had been donated by Mary to Irving House Museum. And through those little glimpses and pieces of archival research, I was able to piece together a picture of a real living person. And I think that's a sign of what looking in the archives can do. You never know what you might find, but you're sure to find something you never expected. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Audrey. And that's something we're really trying to do at the New Westminster Museum, is to really show the people of New West, whether it's the people who donated items, people's ancestors. Even in the modern day period, we're trying to get more of these histories. And we'll talk more about that later. Right now, I want to introduce everybody to Kasarina. She's one of our new volunteers that has joined us since the pandemic started. Kasarina is just finishing up a master's degree on Victory Gardens, War Gardens, Depression era gardens, and so on. She has been doing research with us since the summer on the Horticultural Society. And while she was doing that, she came across an interesting story and asked if it could be part of tonight's presentation. So, Kasarina, please take it away.
Great. Thank you so much for that welcome. And thanks so far to everyone else for their wonderful presentations. So on April 13th, 1914, a certain Mr. James Taylor of Vancouver appeared at the Royal Columbian Hospital shortly after midnight with a severe head injury. He arrived with Mr. Elof Nelson, who wrapped his head in a towel and gave him clothes to wear as his own, were dirtied with mud and blood. 15 hours later, Mr. Taylor was proclaimed dead due to a fractured skull. So, as Juana mentioned, I'm actually researching the Horticultural Society in New Westminster and not mystery murder. But while I was reading newspapers about different horticultural efforts across the city, I came across this story and was very intrigued in the way that it was written in the local newspaper, the New Westminster News. So I followed this story as far as I could get, and I will take you through what I know, and perhaps it will spike someone else's interest to investigate more. So on the 9th of April 12th, Taylor attended an evening of gambling hosted by Nelson. Nelson was known by police for his illegal gambling operations on Kelly Street in Sapperton. He had previously been fined and given a warning, yet in the spring of 1914, Nelson continued to hold gambling nights at his place, often cooking for them as well as hosting the poker matches. They featured men from across Vancouver, New Westminster, and the Fraser Valley, including James Taylor. Prior to the evening of the 12th, Taylor had lost a significant amount of money while gambling at Nelson's. But that evening, his luck turned with a win of roughly $100. That would be the equivalent of about $2,250 in 2020. And so he took his leave from Nelson's to catch the 11:30 Burnaby Lake car home, back to Vancouver. So at the time, the BC Electric Rail ran through New West, and that would have been his car home. Unfortunately, as Taylor turned onto Major Street to head towards the streetcar, he was brutally attacked. So next slide, please. Taylor, despite the trauma to his head, ran after his attacker along Major Street and back onto Kelly Street, only to lose sight of him. From there, Taylor managed to reach Nelson's place where he sought help. So it's unclear from the evidence in the newspapers where exactly Nelson's home was on Kelly Street, but I suspect it was on the northern part of the street, north of Major. And so he would have left there, walked along Major, was attacked, and then ran after his attacker back along Major Street, and then eventually went back to Nelson's to get help. So at the hospital, Nelson requested the aid from doctors, but Taylor refused to speak. Later, this puzzled the press and the police. The police, in fact, were not informed of the incident by Taylor or Nelson, but instead by the local press, the New Westminster News, who had heard about it after the two of them arrived to the emergency. Without any statement from Taylor, the police were left to investigate how this attack turned murder occurred. Given Taylor's soiled clothing revealed that he had $126.75 on him after leaving Nelson's house, the police felt that it was likely the attacker intended to rob Taylor of his money. Upon investigation of the crime scene on Major Street, they found an iron switch rod, which was used on the BCER cars, which was covered in blood and hair. It was presumed the attacker used this on Taylor, intending to stun him for the robbery, but upon hearing his pleas for help, struck again before running away. Thus, within hours of Taylor's death, it became apparent who and, or not who, but why and how he was killed. However, the greatest mystery remains who tried to kill Taylor. So next slide, please. The night of Taylor's attack, there were several other men who were at Nelson's gambling den, and those who would have known that Taylor was carrying a large sum of cash, yet all appeared to be innocent. Fellow gamblers, Shepard and Phillips, who left around the same time as Taylor, were accounted for, and they were the main suspects in the initial investigation. Another fella, Forrester, left Nelson shortly before the attack and traveled along Major and then Columbia to reach his home on Curie Street just south of the Royal Columbian. Forrester recalled seeing two men on his way home, one on the corner of Sherbrooke Street and another on Hospital. However, there appears no connection between these men and Taylor's attack. The best clue as to who came from a Kelly Street neighbor, W.H. Gray, the principal of the Richard McBride School. Principal Gray and his wife heard the cries of Taylor and went to their porch to see what was happening. There, Gray noticed a tall man in a gray raincoat and a felt hat scurry along towards Kelly Street in the direction of Sherbrooke, just as the 11:30 Burnaby Lake car could be heard passing by. From there, the trail runs dry and the murder mystery remains unsolved. Next. I guess that's the last slide. So James Taylor was, his body was transported to the United States for burial where his family resided. And Elof Nelson was charged again with hosting an illegal gambling den, which this time his fine was $200 rather than $50. And after this incident, he swore that he would never host another gambling den, given that the risk was too high for the return. And that's all that I was able to find. I would be curious to investigate more on this, but from the New Westminster News, I was unable to find any further leads on the story. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. Our next speaker and our last speaker for tonight is Jasmine. Jasmine is also a new volunteer. She, in fact, started in, I believe, the last week of November. And as a new volunteer, when we were going over the history of New Westminster, she was really intrigued by the Great Fire in New West. Jasmine is a high school student joining us from Surrey. Jasmine, if you want to take it away.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Yeah, so next slide, please. Okay, so what happened? So on September 10th, 1898, a fire took place in New Westminster, and it basically destroyed the downtown area of the city. And within 10 minutes, the brick buildings on Front Street, they caught on fire, and they ignited nearby canneries before they were also cut loose on the river. So to the left, you can see a picture of Front Street, and you can see how it's all destroyed, and this is how it looked after the fire. Yeah, so next slide, please. So this is a picture of a few buildings after the fire, and you can also see how they are destroyed and demolished. Next slide. So how did the fire start? So one possibility of how the fire started was that hay that was being stored on the B&K wharf, it actually caught on fire and it extended around 200 feet along the waterfront. And what happened was that the hay that was caught on fire, it then spread. And although it's not known how the hay caught on fire, they still know that hay was the main cause of the fire. And to the left, you can see a picture of the waterfront and how the rails are destroyed. Next slide. So who was involved? The Hayak Brigade were alerted at 11 p.m. and they were New Westminster's first ever fire department. So you can see a picture of them. And what's cool is the word Hayak actually means quick and fast. And the word brigade means team. So quick team. And they did live up to their name because they were very efficient with their work. And they did help quickly extinguish the fire. Next slide. So something really cool was that women actually contributed a lot to the fire. So what they did was after the fire, women in the town gave food to the homeless and to the firemen, such as sandwiches and hot coffee. And the Women's Relief Committee actually donated goods such as money, sugar, flour, and clothing because they wanted to help people that went out of business after the fire. And this is really cool because women are not really talked a lot about in history, and it's so significant how much they contributed to the fire. Next slide. So the aftermath. So the city from Royal Avenue to the waterfront had been destroyed. The lower portion, known as the swamp, so aka Chinatown, was swept bare, and the damage was assessed at nearly $2.5 million, and around 5 million families lost their homes. So it's known that no one was directly killed by the fire. However, one person did die due to the shock of him seeing his business burn down in the fire. Next slide. So the new Westminster Library, which was the first ever library in British Columbia, and it was destroyed by the fire. So the only books that remained were a few that were saved by Alderman William A. Johnson, and among them was the Queen's book. So I'm not actually sure what the Queen's book is, but since he did save it, it's probably a very significant piece. And to the left, you can see a picture, and that is actually a picture of the library that was rebuilt after, because there's actually, I don't think there is any pictures of the original library that was actually destroyed. Yeah, next slide. So what buildings survived? So the Gouchon Block, which is the Queen's Hotel, and the Met and the Burr Block, which is the Met Hotel, they survived. And what's really cool is this is actually right beside the Columbian SkyTrain station. So if you go there, you can see these buildings. Next slide. So the significance of this is that the entire city came together as one, and they helped with the aftermath of the fire. This displayed a sense of unity because everyone was able to work together as a team and display teamwork. And I'm just really proud of that because it shows how well that even in the past, a lot of people were able to work together and display unity. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jasmine. That was a great talk. And now I will stop the recording and we can get started with